Today is May 27th, 2021. My name is Enchi. I'm an associate curator at the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University. Today we're interviewing our Houston-based artist, Hong Hong. Thank you so much, Hong Hong, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Anne.
Yeah, to start, we're very excited to hear about your stories. Can you start by telling us when and where were you born?
Yeah, I was born in Hefei, Anhui, in China, and it's a big metropolis with lots and lots of really tall buildings. And my family and I lived there until I was about 10 years old.
Can you share with us some of the memories about the city Hefei and what was it like back then?
Well, I had a very happy childhood because I was surrounded by a really large extended family, which I think is really important, especially for only children. So I had all of my cousins and we would see each other on the weekends, and I was the oldest and I would bully everybody. Like I wasn't like a good sibling. Because like in China, if you're older, you're supposed to like be nicer to the younger kids. But I was like, I'm stronger, I'm gonna beat you up. So there was a lot of playtime. My grandparents were there, aunts and uncles. I grew up with my grandparents. They pretty much raised me while my mom and dad were working and doing their own careers. And we lived on campus at one of the local universities, and I used to walk to the field with my grandparents, and they would do their like little synchronized movements and exercises, and I would like run around in circles. And then there was like a time where I lived with my mom. My dad was sort of like traveling around. I'm probably like going into too much detail, but anyway, I was really sickly when I was little, so I stayed home from school like all the time, like once a week or once every 2 weeks. And school like in China is like really strict, you know. And so I loved staying home because nobody was bossing me around. And I would have babysitters when my grandma couldn't come. And I just started drawing on the walls of my parents' apartment because I love to draw. And surprisingly, they didn't get upset with me. So they let me fill up the entire apartment with drawings. It went from like floor to shoulder height, over a number of years. So this was like a multi-year project, I guess. And that was my favorite thing to do when I was little. I used to make up stories as I drew. Like I would be narrating a story of like, this whale is eating a lollipop. And then I would draw the story. And I had favorite areas to draw in, and in those areas I would make drawings on top of each other, and it was so black with graphite that you wouldn't be able to tell what I was drawing because I'm just such a creature of habit. But yeah, that was great. I love doing that. I didn't get to do, I mean, aside from playing with my cousins, I didn't get to do a lot of the stuff that other kids got to do because I was mostly unwell. And I also remember going through the city on the back of my mom's bike. That was how she took me to different places. I remember, my mom putting me on the bus and just being like I was like tiny and everybody was like crowded around me, or like the bus is rumbling and then I get to my grandma's and she picked me up. And yeah, I had a lot of support. Everybody was around me, and which obviously I took for granted at the time because I was just a baby, growing up. And yeah, it was really loud. There was a lot of sounds and textures and colors, and the color palette of my hometown is definitely different from the color palette of, say, Houston or any other city that I've lived in America. And yeah, so that's my childhood in a nutshell.
Wow, that's super exciting. And hearing you talk about palette of a city, that's a really refreshing and brand new way to describe a city. What is the image that first come into your mind of Hefei in your childhood?
I think that's really hard to say because I think memory is really unstable. I think we're constantly rewriting our memories. And I think that the relationship between the present and the past is not always so clear. I think that my memory of Hefei is really pixelated in that there's a lot of foggy, shadowy areas where I'm just like, I don't really know what that looks like. You know, it's kind of gray. It's kind of like you're in a video game, you can't really see, but then there are other areas that are just like crystal clear to me, you know, and it would probably be my grandparents' house. You know, it was covered with plants because my grandpa was obsessed with plants. Like he had like 50 plants. And I also remember the way that the alleyways smelled. There were these pepper trees or something like that, and I've only ever smelled that, you know, when I was a little girl, and since I've gone back to visit my family. I also remember seeing the sky through the bodies of the buildings, and when I was little I didn't really realize that the sky could be more than like 6 inches because there's so much verticality, you know. I think in most Chinese cities there is a sensation of being hugged, you know, by people, by structures, by conversation. I think it's a very lively, animated image, but it's an image that's constantly coming in and out of focus because I'm not really sure what's real and what's unreal about it.
Wow, that's so beautiful and so intimate the way you share it. And I'm also curious, what food did you eat and what your family would cook?
Oh my God, yes. Yes, now we're getting to the good parts.
Yes.
Yeah, so I had 2 sets of grandparents. They have very different food philosophies. Like my dad's mom wasn't from Hefei, she's from another part, and her food is like really salty. Everything is fried, you know. And I don't remember exactly what those dishes were, but they were really spicy. Like I would be sweating as I ate them. And then my mom's parents, you know, my grandma on that side is a doctor. My apo, she's a doctor, so she's very like health conscious. So she's like, we absolutely need to have bok choy for dinner every night, and you can't put salt in it. So every night for dinner, we just have like this really like plain, watery bok choy. And all of her dishes were kind of like laid back compared to the other side of the family. My favorite things to eat, honestly, I love a Chinese breakfast. You know, I love that it's savory. I love that I used to eat like baozi, and then I would eat it with like xiancai, I don't know how to say it, or like you know, like veggies that are like salty and spicy, and then you would eat it with like fermented tofu. That was my favorite thing. And I also really liked miangao. So like the sticky rice and you dip it into sugar for like New Year's. I really like that. And I remember like we used to get yogurt delivered in these glass bottles, and I loved waking up to the sound of like the clink outside the door. And I'm like, I'm gonna get the yogurt. And then we would drink the yogurt through a straw. And my favorite thing to eat with my mom actually is we used to go to food stands all the time, and she would take me to watch people. I mean, she wouldn't take me to watch people, but I would be obsessed with like watching people make noodles. Oh my God, that was amazing. I was like so obsessed with that. I would be like, Mom, can you take me to a noodle shop so I can like watch people make noodles? And they would make it, and we would have like 牛肉面, like spicy beef noodles. And then my other favorite thing, you can tell that I love talking about this, is I remember when it was really cold, we didn't have like a lot of heat. So my mom would buy me these sweet potatoes that they would bake on the street. And you know, you'd be walking in the winter and I have my gloves on and I would keep the sweet potato in my hand for warmth. Um, yeah, and then my dad owned a restaurant, but I never really went. But I remember being obsessed with these like little cranes that they would carve out of carrots. And every night my dad, when he came home from work, he would bring me a little carved crane. And I really loved that as a token from my father. But also it was magical to know that materials could transform, you know, in that way. But yeah, that's just like the top. That's just the top of my list. There's a lot of other foods that I liked.
Yeah, if you could share a recipe with us, either in video or in paper write-up, any form, we'd love to archive it as well.
Yeah. I'll send something to you. Yeah.
Thank you. And also, I'm really fascinated by your name because it's in English it's Hong Hong, but in Chinese it's two different words, both to do with water, but it has different meanings. And in terms of how it connects water, can you tell us a little bit about your name and who gave you the name?
Yeah. So I was born on January 11th, and the area that we lived in is sort of tropical, so we didn't really see snow that often. But it was snowing on the day that I was born. So everyone in my family was like, we need to name her Snow. And then, but then like my dad's mom has this accent, you know, she speaks in dialect. So she was saying the word for snow, 雪, but she was saying like shit, you know. And my mom's like, no, no, that doesn't sound good. We can't name her Snow. Like, So my mom like vetoed everyone. And my dad's name is Flood. And obviously that's sort of, it's a natural disaster. It's very powerful. It's very violent. And it has all of these connotations that my mom sort of wanted to maybe cancel, maybe not move away from, but just make softer. So my mom is really into like poetry. You know, I think she wanted to be a writer for a long time. And I think she was probably reading some poems when she should have been studying for one of her tests in college or in high school. And the second part of my name, the second Hong, comes from it comes from like really old Chinese, I think. And the phrase is actually 一泓清水. So it's a unit of measurement that poets would use to sort of approximate the presence of like really clear, transparent, slow, deep water. So that the kind of water that's welcoming, the kind of water that you want to sort of swim through or dive into. So she was like, so I think my mom was like, if she's going to be a flood of anything, she's going to be a flood of something like this, like really beautiful. So she named me Hong Hong, which kind of translates into a flood of clear, deep water. And that's my name.
Wow, that's such a beautiful name. And knowing that you have been such a fluid person in like identity and diaspora, been in all these different cities and spaces and countries, it definitely really manifests your persona very well.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next, I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about your parents and if they shared any of their own stories with you?
So my parents, you know, they're not, I think at some point we realize that our parents are people with their own histories, but it doesn't happen until much later. And I'm sort of just getting started with that process. My parents are very Chinese in that they want to keep a lot from me. You know, they're just like, we don't want to tell you anything because we want you to just do your best and like do whatever you have to do. So whenever I call my parents, I'm like, hey, how's it going? They're just like, great, we're doing good. Good. Like, that's like the conversation for like years, So I think that they're a little bit reluctant to talk about themselves, but they do talk about my grandparents, a little bit more. So my dad and mom went to high school together, and my mom was sort of like a bookworm, like, so in Chinese it's like 书呆子. So she was just like, she was very quiet, like very shy, had big glasses like me. And when she was supposed to be like listening in class, she would have like the book that she's supposed to read, and then she would have like a novel inside that book because she loved reading so much. And then my dad is kind of like the opposite. Like, he was really outgoing and like kind of a troublemaker because they both went to like a really good high school. But my dad was there because his father was the principal, and my grandpa wanted to expose my dad to more discipline, to more rigorous learning. So they were very, very different in high school. And I think my mom told me that my dad didn't really talk to her in high school, but then after they graduated, he was like, oh, I'm on the reunion committee. And he was like, we should get together and talk about our high school reunion. And she was kind of surprised because she's not super outgoing. She was like, okay, yeah, like, come over. And then they went to different different colleges, kind of separate from each other. And they wrote each other letters, and eventually they got married. And my mom was teaching history at a university, and my dad was also a teacher. But also my dad is kind of like, he has so many different kinds of experiences. Like, he was a tour guide and was like, he traveled across China all the way over to Tibet. 1 year he was like off doing that. and then he started a restaurant, and did that for a few years. And then he was like, I want to go to America. And that was his next thing. So my dad has always been really adventurous, but he's a Sagittarius, so that makes sense, like half man, half horse. My mom was she wasn't just, but she was consistently a history teacher. And really, like, my understanding of my parents really deepened after we moved to the United States, because like I said, I grew up with extended family. So I didn't really, I saw my parents consistently, but not as much as, maybe like an American child would see their mom and dad. I saw my grandparents a lot more. And so, yeah, so my immediate memories of my parents begin in North Dakota after we, moved from China to the States. But they both grew up during the Cultural Revolution. They don't really talk about it that much. I know my grandparents don't really talk about it because I think it was sort of like really challenging for them. I know both sets, because my dad's parents both worked in education. So that was being reformed. So my grandpa had to go through a lot. I know that he was probably in prison for a little while, and really that was like a big thing. And then my mom's side comes from sort of a wealthier family. They were doctors, in a small village. So my grandpa and my grandma on that side were sent to labor camps. And then my mom and her brother, my uncle, stayed with other members of the family who were in the city. So they were taken care of, but they were separated from their parents. And I think that it was a tumultuous time. There was a lot happening, a lot of shifts, a lot of, collisions sometimes between different kinds of people and different sets of ideologies. And there was a lot of like churning and things like that. So whenever things get hard, my grandparents they usually say like, well, you'll be fine. It's not like there's a revolution or anything like that. And yeah, so that's sort of the before me history of my family. And then there's the after me history of my family as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I felt like Chinese parents, they really try to protect their kids so well from any
Yeah.
trauma they experience themselves. Um,
Yeah. Like I remember recently, just because of the wave of like, anti-Chinese, sentiment in America, I was really worried about my parents because, they're older, they're in upstate New York. So I would call home and I'd be like, and for a long time, I couldn't even bring myself to say anything because I think like my parents really tried hard to assimilate, you know, into they really tried their best to be American, I think in so many different ways because they wanted to do well for themselves. They also wanted to do well for their extended family. And I think they also wanted to do well for me. So part of their efforts, they were like funneled into that, so for a long time, I couldn't bring myself to be like, oh, you really have to be careful because I think it would just like break their hearts a little bit. But then when I finally brought it up, I'm like, like make sure if you're out walking by yourself, just keep your eyes open. And then my parents they were never like, they're like, we're not scared. We're totally fine. We're doing great, but they do that. They do that for us, or my parents do that for me, for sure, in so many ways, you know.
yeah, definitely. And with the interesting that you brought up assimilation, which I really wanted to, although like later on, but I would really love to hear what were some of the things that they try to assimilate with, for example.
Oh, you do you want me to talk about that right now?
Yeah, would that
Yeah.
be?
Yeah. I just wasn't sure. I'm totally happy to say whatever. Yeah, I think the first thing is language, but that's practical as well as symbolic. I think language is the architecture of reality. I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like a slightly different person in Chinese. Like when I'm speaking Chinese, my persona in Chinese is like a little sillier, like a little louder, maybe like funnier. Like I'm not funny in English, but I am like funny in Chinese. Probably because I don't speak it like super well. Some people are just like, what is she saying? Um, but I think the first thing is language. I remember when I was going to elementary school in North Dakota, my dad would make me speak in English with him when I came home. They would always ask me what I had for lunch, and I always had to answer in English, right? And later, I think assimilation happened through food. I think our diets changed. I remember when my mom and I landed in Los Angeles, my uncle, who was living in LA at the time, took us to like Pizza Hut. And I remember my mom and I are just like, this is disgusting. I was like, ew, why are we here? But then later pizza started creeping back into our lives. And I remember like in North Dakota, my parents were making pizza and they were making like Hawaiian pizza with like pineapples on it. So our diets changed. We started speaking English a little more often at home. And I think that there's a lot of habits that we slowly shifted. In China at the time, we didn't really have access to washing machines. So I remember when I was little, we all did our laundry by hand with like a washing board. So the change of clothes, it didn't happen as often as it did in America. When we came to America, I was like, oh, people change their clothes every day. And that was a huge shift for us. But then and then once we started doing it, it's just something that we've continued to do. But there were all of these little things, like suddenly we could take showers, like, because my mom had to boil water and then put it in a bucket. And then we showered like that for like the first 2 years of my life. But then we got a bathtub. So there were a lot of like shifts, and I think like everything really changed. It was kind of like a totally different way of living. And I mean, also in addition to that, we were jumping between different kinds of environments. Like the topography in North Dakota is totally different from the topography of a metropolis in China, right? I mean, I think that there was a sense of, I think in China, we had very little privacy, because we were living with extended families, and then in America, there was suddenly a lot of privacy. And I think that my parents over time have really grown to love that sense of privacy, that distance between yourself and another family. Now it's something that they really cherish. But I think that being able to love it is also a facet of assimilation. It is a very different way of living. Sound travels differently in North Dakota than it does in a city in China. I remember when we first got to North Dakota, my mom was like, it's so quiet. We were used to hearing our neighbors. We were used to having friends come by. We were used to like my mom and my grandmother arguing like every other day, just bickering. But suddenly all of that receded from us. And we were in this snowy, flat landscape where suddenly the sky was the biggest thing that there was. Suddenly the sky was thousands of miles all around us, instead of just being like a river of blue between buildings. I'm like way off topic. I don't know where I went with that. Sorry. I was trying to talk about assimilation and I started talking about the sky. But anyway, I think that the process of assimilation happened in so many different areas. From how to navigate your body in the city, how to travel between point A and point B, and like the route that you would take from point A to point B, that's all different. And I think like part of what my parents had to do was first getting used to all of those changes and then cherishing some of those changes, cherishing that silence, cherishing the distance, cherishing speaking English, cherishing pizza, and yeah, I think assimilation is an ongoing, long process,
Wow, thank you for sharing. And I'm also very curious about the family value that your parents brought you up with, in terms of before coming to the US and after. Like, did you observe any changes?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my parents were not super hands-on in my childhood. I mostly spent it with my grandparents, who were strict, but they've already been parents once. So I was like the golden child, they were like, oh, let's have fun, take her out on walks and stuff like that. I mostly played with my grandparents, and my parents did discipline me every once in a while, but it was very rare. But I think part of what immigrants carry with them is this desire or hunger to be accepted, to be seen as valuable, to be seen or to be described as indispensable, to this new society that they're now attempting to be a part of. And, I think, at least for my family, which is a family of academics, education was always really important. They always told me that I had to do well in school and blah, blah, blah. But that really sort of intensified once we arrived in America, because, suddenly they didn't have access to these structures that I think made them feel safe. I think being in the same city as your parents, being able to ask for what you want easily, being able to understand humor and nuance, knowing where to go, you know, all of these qualities give you a sense of safety. And my parents didn't have that for many years, you know, and part of their struggle was sort of projected onto me, right? Because our family unit is struggling to survive, or struggling to stay in America, or struggling to, you know, to be accepted, or to be maybe not so outside of things, or not, I mean, we look different, so there's nothing we could do about that, you know. But after moving to America, they were very, very strict with my studies. I had to study a lot. My dad always told me, like, you have to do 10 times better than an American. You know, I mean, I remember that was like a constant thing. Like, I was like a straight A student. I was like really smart. I mean, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I did really well academically. And I remember I'd bring home straight A's. My dad would be like, you need to do better than that. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's better than straight A's, you know, but one thing that always stuck with me was the fact that he would say to me, you need to do better than everyone else around you. When they're playing, you have to study. When they're on summer vacation, you have to do, you know, supplemental work. You know, you need to sort of start prepping for the SATs when you're like 14, you know. And honestly, that sounds like a lot of pressure, and it was in some ways, but I think that also my parents were in a difficult situation where they didn't have financial security, and they had this dream of coming to America and making it. You know, I mean, America in Chinese is 美国, which means beautiful country. So every time you say America, you're sort of implying that there's this dream or this beauty or this quality that maybe China doesn't have, you know, 美国, the beautiful country. So my parents, I think, just wanted to create something beautiful. And the only way that they could do this is through hard work, you know, because immigration is a very complicated process where you're evaluated, you know, it's like a dissertation. So I think that there was always this emphasis on excellence, you know, on discipline, on vertical ascendance, you know, moving up, 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 and being better and better and better and better. And yeah, they wanted me to be a doctor. You know, it's like, you know, that's pretty widespread, I think. And they wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant, you know, something like that. Something with a stable future, with a future that they could understand and foresee. You know, that was really important to them. So yeah, so I studied a lot. I was like very nerdy.
Wow, that's fascinating to hear your parents kind of living their American dream through you as well. I'm wondering if they were supportive in your pursuit in art once they heard that you're going to be an artist.
Yeah. Okay, so this is hard for me to answer, because I think if we look at it at a surface level, you know, the conclusion that maybe anybody would arrive at would be that my parents were not supportive, you know. But I want to say, on a deeper level, they've always been very supportive of me. They love me probably more than anything else in this world. And everything that they've done their best because of me. And I think it's like so important to acknowledge that, because I think we're all very different people. You know, they come from a specific time and I come from a totally different time. We have different values, we have different expectations, you know. So conflict, I think intergenerational conflict in first generation immigrant families, I think it's pretty normal. You know, I would be surprised if there weren't, you know, because there are Chinese values and then there are American values, and they're different, so they clash. So anyway, So after saying all of that, I didn't tell my parents. I honestly didn't think that I was going to be an artist. Like, I don't think I ever like had that thought. And I just remember I had to declare my major when I was maybe 20 years old, and I wrote art just because. Like, I had never thought about it before. Like, I was taking like calculus 2 in college. I was like getting ready to be like an accountant or to study English lit. But for some reason, when I filled out that form, I wrote art. And I was very lucky because I got a full scholarship to undergrad. So I was on I had a merit scholarship. So my parents, they didn't have any collateral. You know, they couldn't be like, if you're not a math major, we're not paying for college, because I had a full ride. So I knew I could leverage that. So that's when the conflicts begin. You know, they were very against that. They didn't want me to be an artist. They were worried that I would suffer. You know, I mean, I think that being an artist, well, being an artist is different for everybody. Everybody has a different path. But I think, you know, regardless of whether or not you're successful, there's a lot of hard work. You know, if you're doing really well as an artist, there's the expectations of galleries, there's the onslaught of shows. You know, I think that's a really heavy expectation. And when you're less well known, you're just trying to make art and feed yourself, which is really challenging. So their worries were warranted, but we fought a lot. There were like a lot of email exchanges where my mom was like, you can still switch your major to accounting. You have 2 months left. And even when I went to graduate school, they were still very like, no, they were like, well, you know, why don't you just study graphic design? Like, they were always pushing like architecture or graphic design. But anyway, so they were not supportive. They didn't really understand my love for what I do and my love for making things and making objects. And that created a pretty big distance between myself and my parents. But I think that's normal for most children. You know, the distance occurs one way or another. You know, you have to be pushed away from the womb, so to speak, in some way, twice. Once when you're born and once when you want to go do something, you know. And some people are lucky in that their parents are supportive. But anyway, I want to say that even though they were so adamant about the fact that they didn't support me, I honestly think that was one of the best kinds of supports that I could have gotten. I think because they gave me nothing in that regard, I had to be strong. I had to be courageous. I had to learn how to have conviction. I had to learn how to have inner direction and navigation, and I had to learn how to self-comfort and self-love. And I think conviction is one of the most important things that you can have as an artist, you know, because you are your own compass. And without them, I wouldn't have that. So yeah, I guess on one hand, they didn't support me, but on the other hand, they also gifted me with one of the most important qualities that I believe to be one of the most important qualities to being a practicing artist. So it's like, you know, what is support? I'm not really sure, you know.
Wow, that's so fascinating to hear you strive through and become an artist. And I'm sure they're very proud of you today, seeing.
Yes.
Yeah. And also going back a little bit, you talked about that you were dealing with sickness in your childhood, and I'm wondering, during those times, did you kind of go to like Chinese classics or like the myths and any of the bedside stories that your parents would tell you about? Because that was kind of referencing to your motif in terms of the pangus, like the Chinese classics. And I'm just curious, when did that enter your life?
Yeah, so when I was sick, I drew pictures and then I read books. So because that was what I did to pass the time. I love reading, and my mom had so many books around the house. And I remember I used to make a little clock out of books. So one book would be 9 o'clock, the next book would be 10 o'clock. And I would read the 9 o'clock book at 9. And then at the 10, when it turned 10, I would pick up the 10 a.m. book. And then I go through like 3 or 4 hours doing just that. And that was my first encounter with myths. You know, my mom is really interested in philosophy and spirituality and religion. She had books on all different kinds of religions in the house. I remember like one year, I think I was like 6, and Santa brought me the Bible. You know, not that my family is religious, but my mom felt that it was important that I'm exposed to these ideas, these larger questions of why are we here and who are we, even as a young child. And I'm interested in myths because of my experiences of reading my mom's books about them. I think myths are kind of like stories that people tell us because they hope that we'll be able to walk away understanding what's important or what we need to know in order to survive and be well. And so, yeah, so I read them when I was younger. And honestly, I read Penguin when I was much younger. And then I sort of like forgot about it. You know, it's not something that I consciously thought about, you know, for like 10 years. But when I was starting to make paper, which I started doing, I think in my early 20s, I was also starting to sort of return to the stories of my girlhood, you know, in some ways because I felt as if I was losing the language. I felt as if I was losing my own memories of my motherland. And in some ways, I felt that I was losing parts of who I was because I didn't have a tight enough hold on these stories or on these ideas or on these experiences, you know. And I think that was a way of homecoming for me, you know, because sometimes when you're an immigrant, you don't get to go home very often. You don't get to return to your grandmother's arms. You know, you don't get to walk into the house that you grow up in. So what you're left with are remnants, you know, bits and pieces of things that were important to you. And what was important to me were those stories. So, so I first saw them when I was much younger, and I was like, cool, love this. And then when I read them again when I was older, my understanding of those stories were much different, you know, and I was doing it as a way to go back home when I couldn't.
Wow, that's fascinating. And when you were talking about you filled in art as your major when you were deciding, like, what was the trigger? Because I'm kind of trying to get more inside how art has become so kind of important in your life, and whether any person in particular that impacted that decision or any kind of trigger or event that happened.
Um, you know, I can't say that there was any triggering event. It was very mundane, like probably happened on a Wednesday, you know, and yeah, there was nothing special about it. I had to do it. Like it was easy because I felt like I had to do it. It was easy because, you know, it's like waking up and eating breakfast. You're hungry. Of course you're going to do it. It's like the easiest thing in the world. So when I did it, I was like, yeah, I need to do this. So easy, done. And I think maybe that moment was lighthearted because there was already a reservoir of time that I had spent with art. You know, I said earlier that I spent a lot of my time drawing when I was a little girl. And that was a formative experience. And even after coming to America, I continued drawing and painting. That was the thing that I could do for myself, you know, and that was something that I could do anywhere. That was something, it gave me a sense of power when I felt powerless, right? Because there's nothing more powerful than making a mark where you want that mark to go. You know, it's kind of a way of organizing a world that seemed chaotic and unstable at times. And again, it brought me a sense of home. It brought me a sense of comfort because I had started doing it when I was much younger. And then in college, I just, you know, I was painting and I just loved it. You know, it was easy because I loved it. I'm not saying that making art or being an artist is easy, but there's something easy about that love, you know. It's like a favorite blanket or something.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear that art is so close to home for you. And did you kind of grow up having any kind of exposure to arts besides making art yourself? For example, going to museum shows or seeing, seeing anyone painting? Because I also felt there's a lot of like ink wash kind of sense in your work. So I'm also curious how probably if there was any kind of Chinese classical painting that you saw that might have impacted your practices.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that because my grandpa really liked collecting stamps. I mean, he had like so he was a big collector, like collector of plants, so many plants, and then like so many stamps. And I used to look at his stamp collection when I was little, and you know, they're tiny, but they're often beautiful ink paintings of landscapes. You know, and I used to flip through these and look at them. I didn't really go to museums because I don't come from like an artistic or creative family. Like no one in my family ever was like, let's go to the art museum. I mean, even to this day, like no one wants to go to the museum. So I didn't ever go to a museum. I didn't go to a museum until I was like 21. Yeah, I was very late, very late to the game. But I do remember those tiny little stamps that my grandpa had and how beautiful those landscapes were. And actually my grandpa, that's my mom's dad, my gong, he was the only one who told my entire family, like, he was like, she's a genius. She's totally going to be an artist. And then everyone else is like, shut up. She's not going to be an artist. She's going to be a lawyer. So he exposed me to the idea that being an artist was a thing, that somebody had to make those paintings, you know. And my grandfather, he was an industrial designer. He used to paint portraits and he was very hands-on, you know, did bonsai, he did calligraphy and all of that. So I think that's, you know, my earliest exposure to art was watching my grandpa bend plants and watching my grandpa do calligraphy and looking through his stamp books with him.
Wow, that's fascinating to hear that. And also, I'm curious what, because you study painting, what were some of the earlier works and motifs that you were doing in your kind of earlier career?
Yeah, so do you mean when I was like 18, 19, 20, 21 maybe?
Yeah, in college and your grad school.
Okay. Yeah, so I was mainly working figuratively. I was making these really realistic kind of large scale still portraits of people's figures and faces sort of disintegrating into abstract mark making. And I think that I have always been interested in working at such a large scale, partially because of my experiences of drawing on the walls of my parents' apartment. You know, I love the feeling of stretching out, you know, the performative aspect of working monumentally, where your body kind of becomes an instrument, where it feels like a choreography or a dance, rather than, you know, really controlled movements, right? Yeah, so I was painting, I was using oil paint, I was painting portraits of people I knew. I was mainly thinking about themes of identity and the instability of identity, as well as the instability of remembering and the instability of memory. And yeah, so I painted a lot of portraits.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And because I'm also curious if Taoism or any kind of Chinese philosophy or literature, because I know you probably mentioned actually so many different disciplines, like even mathematics, as you were doing calculus too. I'm sure that that was very easy to connect. Yeah, so I'm just fascinated to hear how these all kind of form your narratives and become your motif, and whether the Taoist idea of body as landscape become something that you've thought of as well.
Okay, so here's the thing. So I would love to have a separate conversation about Taoist practices, because actually I don't know very much, but it's something that I'm interested in. You know, obviously I make paper and I work outside. So the phrase that you just brought up, the body as landscape, is something that I'm really interested in. I'm interested in the relationship between micro bodies and macro bodies. I'm interested in the universe as a body, and I'm interested in a single cell as a body. But I don't know enough about Taoism to really elaborate on any of that. I can only speak to those ideas from my own experiences of, you know, working with paper. But you know what I will say is that my grandmother is Buddhist, you know, and we used to go to the temple to pray when I was little, and we used to go together maybe once a year or a few times a year. And I remember when we were in the temple, we would always get these sheets of holy paper from the monks who were there, right? And do you remember? And then we would write down our wishes on the holy paper. And then my grandma would pick me up and I would tie both of our wishes to the branches of this holy tree that was in the middle of that temple. And so, and also, you know, my family burns paper to communicate with ancestors, you know. My grandfather recently passed, and I've been burning these little poems for him. So paper was always a way for my grandmother to communicate with gods that wouldn't really ever answer back. You know, they were silent gods, they were distant gods. And it's also, paper is something that we use to communicate with people who are no longer here, who are in a different realm. So I was always interested in paper because of that, you know. And then there's also like this something elemental about the practice of making paper. You're physically, every single sheet of paper started as a tree, you know, and there's wood, you know, you have to cook the paper, like the bark, and then there's fire, and then it happens outside. It has to do with wind and atmosphere. And when you're making paper, you're mixing so much water with all the different materials, so there's water. So I know that the elements is also really important, you know. At least like my grandma used to tell me that. But anyway, so that all of that is to say that I wish I knew more. It's something that I'm interested in. These are the ideas that I'm really interested in developing and learning more about, because I think it is important to me, but maybe it's subconscious a little bit, you know.
Yeah, that totally connects to what you've always been saying, that paper and the making of it is ritualistic. And then now I see why it's ritualistic, because it's like a communication with the ancestrals, and the fire and the water and the wood and like the five elements. And
Yeah. Exactly.
would you like to talk a little bit more about how it connects to the five elements, or if that's something that
Yeah, I guess I can just talk about my work like in general a little bit. So the sort of images that I'm working with kind of evoke portals, channels, bridges and rivers, and they're intentionally made to be sort of experienced in that way. I mean, earlier I talked about wanting to go home. And I think for me, making paper is an act of homecoming, which is essentially impossible. It connects me to my memories of my grandmother speaking to the divine. It also connects me to, watching myself burn something for my grandfather, my two grandfathers who are gone. And what's really interesting about paper is that, like I said, you have to mix, you're starting with bark and repurposed paper, and it's all like really gooey. And then you have to mix so much water into it, which is also interesting because my name is like a flood of clear water. So my mom did a great job. So you're mixing so much water into it. You physically form the object within the landscape, and then all of the water has to evaporate in order for the work to become cohesive, to become an actual object with integrity. And I think a lot about the distance that the water has to travel through the atmosphere, right? Because the vertical is the axis of spiritual ascendance, right? Most of our gods live above us in the sky. And I think about the fact that part of the project has to physically leave the earth and travel into the sky to become rain and weather. And that's a part of the work that I'm really, really interested in, is that physical evaporation. And I think of that as a way to communicate with gods, right? Because we used to tie the holy paper onto the tree because there's this idea that being higher up brings us closer. And if I can't physically leave the earth to understand the universe, then part of my work can. It can travel that irrevocable distance between ourselves and everything that we can't understand. And it's kind of hard to explain, but I make paper horizontally, like the rectangular structure is parallel to the ground. And I think of the paper as something that's mimicking the arc of the surface of the earth at that particular location. There's this great artist who described soil as the skin of the earth. And I was thinking about that. I'm like, oh, but then the sky is the skin of the universe, right? And the paper comes into being between these two immense bodies that we can't understand, because there's a depth to earth, and there's also a depth to the universe, which contains the earth. And it's really quite a small space, but it feels enormous to us. We can't fly, we can't ascend. And I'm also interested, because the paper is made horizontally and part of the paper has to evaporate, there's this tension between the horizontal and the vertical. And I think a lot about that when I display my work, because most of my projects have wall pieces that connect directly with floor pieces. And I have an interest in bodies, partially because paper making is so performative, but also because, I think about the vertical as the space where we make decisions. It's like where we assert our will. It's where we try to make something happen. And I think of my parents coming to the US, immigrating. We're always vertical when this happens, but every night when we sleep, our bodies become horizontal. So the horizontal is really the space for dreams. It's also a space where we give in to our biological circumstance, to pass on. I think about that, and that's why I display my work vertically and horizontally. And paper making is very ritualistic. The same sequence of steps happens every single time, and you have to go through these steps. So there's a certain repetition there. And I think there's a lot of sort of spiritual or religious practices that are repetitive, and when I make the paper, I'm physically circling the rectangle. So there's a Buddhist practice of circumambulation where there's a holy relic and you're physically walking around the relic as sort of a meditative process. And that's partially what I'm thinking of when I create these spheres, right? Is that I want to be able to circulate around the structure multiple times. And yeah, and it's really, the paper is a space where the sky, the weather, the sun, trees, and myself can sort of intersect and connect. Even if it's just for an hour or two, you know, on a specific day.
Wow, that was such a beautiful, and like I just learned so much just from your. Then I also am curious, like you mentioned your dad used to travel to Tibet because he was fascinated by Tibetan Buddhism. Is that?
No, he wanted to be a tour guide. So he would take these groups of people from our hometown, and they would like travel from my hometown into Tibet, sometimes on horseback. I mean, my dad's told me stories where like they're like walking through a rainforest and then they hear like a tiger and then they have to like get low on the ground. So it was like it was kind of like a pilgrimage. I don't think he was going there for that reason, because my dad is kind of, he's not so interested in that aspect of things. He's more like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I think but he's also really adventurous. So I think he just wanted to be a tour guide. And he was like, I'm gonna take you to Tibet. And then these people went with him. Yeah.
So that connection of the Tibetan kind of pilgrimage was your own discovery and your own like kind of connection to your work.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And I remember you also were working with kids on making paper and making works. Can you talk a little bit about the community aspect of your work?
Yeah, I mean, in the last maybe 5 years, I've done a lot of collaborative pours in different spaces. And, you know, the scale of the paper pouring structure that I use kind of looks like a bed, but I also think of it as a table where different people can come together from different places and we talk, we learn from each other, we work really hard, we laugh, and we create something together. You know, it's like an equal space where we're all actively participating in this process, knowing that none of us are fully in control of it, that it's a cumulative effort. But those have primarily been with adults and students. And then my work with kids is just like, paper making is so fun, you know, because it's like really wet. There's like a lot of splashes. It's not very precious, right? You kind of like, when you're holding a pencil, there's kind of like a pressure because you're like, oh, I'm supposed to draw this flower and I don't know if it's going to look like that flower, right? So that there's like a kind of a responsibility. But when you're making paper, there are no expectations, you know. And I think that the thing about paper making that's so fun for children is that it's all about touch. There's no division between you and the material. You're not holding a pen, you're not holding a hammer. It's just your body interacting with this like thing. And that's how we first learn to understand the world, is through our senses, through our hands. So kids love that. You know, we set up, I mean, my favorite part about doing these paper making workshops is when we're able to go to parks, you know, these really like active spaces where it's like really random. We'll set up and it just depends on who's at the park that day. You know, it's neighborhood kids. They'll come through, we make some paper and then they go back to, you know, swing on the swings or sitting on the seesaw, you know. So it's very kind of organic. It depends on the community and it depends on the landscape, and it's fun for the kids. They get really into it. You know, sometimes they get too into it. They end up like splashing each other like a lot. And I'm like, no, like your mom's right there. But yeah, they love it. They're just little tornadoes. They like come in, they make a mess, and then they like move away, you know.
That's so much fun to hear you talk about it. And
Yeah.
I'm also curious, have the lifespan of your works been in, or the conservation aspect of your work and the longevity of it become, has it been in your consideration when you made works?
Um, well, I am interested in I'm interested in the instability of material. I'm interested in the instability of objects. I'm interested in the instability of color. I'm interested in form as something that is constantly being shaped by time, you know. So form is the material, time is the tool. Um, so my works change a lot. You know, they're made to give evidence to what happens to them. You know, paper is open to paper can be very fragile. You know, it remembers everything that happens to it. It's not like the surface of a painting, which can be very plastic. You know, there's a plasticity to paintings, and paper doesn't have that. You know, and the works deteriorate over the course of exhibitions, and as they're being rolled and unrolled, you know, new creases will occur, new tears will occur, but it's just part of the work being marked by time. You know, paper making is about time. It's an activity that unfolds within time. It's also a practice that keeps time. It's seasonal, right? You harvest the bark in the winter, you process the bark in the winter, you make paper outside when summer comes. You know, you can't make paper outside once winter comes. So paper making sort of functions like a calendar and a clock, you know. And in recent works, I'm really interested in the disappearance of color. So I don't dye my work very well, you know, I don't do it correctly so that the dyes fade when they come into contact with sunlight and gallery lighting. And actually, I have an environmental project up at Art League Houston right now, and it started as this like deep blue, kind of really blue, very blue based blues and blacks. And now it's become yellow and green and light blue. I mean, it's changed so much in the last 4 weeks. And these are some of the qualities that I'm interested in pushing, you know, even further, you know. I mean, I say this all the time, but I think existence is additive and reductive. I think things have to be taken away, you know, at some point. And I'm interested in that process. So yeah, so conservationists, if you're listening to this, you're like, oh my gosh, that's a nightmare. And well, I'm not sorry because it's important to me, but I understand your pain.
Yeah, I totally understand. It seems that the disappearance and I felt like maybe the void of like disappearance and leaving space for yeah, the void and emptiness. It's also very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess as we are probably moving on to the next chapter of our interview for your artist vision. So, what do you see artists in the society in this world? I mean, as a societal role in this world?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And before I say anything, I want to say that I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that, because my knowledge is very finite. You know, I am a really specific person, born at a really specific time. And I'm not like some artists. I don't believe that my artwork transcends the time that it comes from and the place that it comes from and the geography that it comes from. I think for me personally, art is a bridge and it's a mirror. When I see works that make me cry, I realize that there is something out there that I can't see, that someone else sees very, very well. And it makes me think maybe that the world is just a veil in front of this other space, you know, and that's like really abstract, but it does, it creates a sense of movement. It creates a sense of possibility. You know, it empowers me because it makes me feel like there's somewhere that I can get to if I spend enough time here, you know? But I also think that art is a mirror. It reflects ourselves back to us. It lets us see parts of ourselves that maybe we weren't seeing so clearly, or maybe it articulates perfectly feelings and thoughts that we've had, but have never been able to, you know, put together as a sentence. You know, there's like an intimacy there. It feels like an embrace, that someone is hugging you, and that somebody else sees you, you know, that somebody else in this world saw you without ever knowing you. And I think that's transcendent. You know, I think it allows us to transcend ourselves, you know, the limitations of who we are, maybe, but also it's not, it's about who we are, you know. So I think it's a bridge, and it's a mirror, you know. And I think there's so many different kinds of art practices out there. You know, some of them are collaborative and communal. You bring people together. Some of them are very conceptual. You know, some of them are very political, but I mean, I think anything is political. I think everything's inherently political, but they all serve a different role. But I think ultimately they're all bridges and mirrors. You know, they tell us who we are, and they tell us where we could go.
Wow, that's so beautifully said. And I'm also wondering, as we just passed like one of the most horrific years in the
yeah.
as especially in Texas, in addition to the pandemic, the kind of the social injustice in 2020, we also just had the winter freeze about 3 months ago. And a lot of the artists are making works and addressing these issues. And like socially engaged art has been a very big thing, as well as we've been seeing artists being addressed by their ethnicities a lot. Do you think it's acceptable to address artists by their ethnicities as we are seeing? I'm not sure if you yourself has been addressed in that way as a Chinese American artist before your name. Do you think that's something that, if you have any comments on that?
That's an interesting question. You know, I think what I've really enjoyed seeing is the specificity of the language that's used to address different artists. So obviously we have a really big word, which is Asian, right? But that word is an umbrella for so many different kinds of communities, you know, really special and really vibrant communities spread out, you know, in vast geographical, you know, distances, lots of different, you know, cultures and languages and things like that. So I think that, you know, being addressed as a Chinese American artist feels good for me, you know, because it's a huge part of who I am. And for a long time, I didn't feel seen, you know, in many different ways. I mean, for a long time, I didn't really know who I was. And I probably still don't, because like, who does? But I think, but it's nice when we can acknowledge the different kinds of people who are out there, you know. And I think, you know, the word Chinese American is also so big, right? It's basically a container for all of these different specific experiences that many different Chinese Americans may have. But it's a small way to say, like, I'm here, and this is how I identify. And I think what's important about that process is that it really depends on the artist. I think that they need to have the power and they need to have the agency to self-identify. You know, I think so much of the art world has to do with sort of like creating a narrative about an artist and their work. And sometimes this narrative is written without their hand. So I think whatever galleries, institutions, publications choose to, you know, describe a practice or describe a person, it first has to come from that person. At first, they need to feel empowered. They need to feel seen. They need to feel that they can create this for themselves, you know? And I think as long as that's present, I think as long as that respect is there and that communication and that openness is there, then I think it's great. You know, I think that there are so many different kinds of people out there. And I think it's really awesome when we can, you know, share our stories and share who we are through labels, through big containers, through art, through conversations, you know. But respect and empowerment, I think, are very, very important things. And specificity. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for sharing. And I guess as we are in Houston and we're trying to connect to the archive, which is the Houston Asian American Archive, can you tell us about how you decided to come to Houston?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I came to Houston to do a year-long fellowship at the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft. And that's where I've been since August of last year. And I've been working in this beautiful garden next to a banana tree and making paper and yeah, putting together exhibitions. And I've been really lucky. I mean, the Craft Center is amazing. The people there are amazing. I felt very supported, you know.
That's fascinating. And I also want to congratulate you since you've been kind of, it's like a Houston takeover for you. Like, being shows at Asia Society, at the Houston Center for Craft, Contemporary Craft, and the Art League Houston. That's definitely, I felt like an amazing, especially as I felt like Asian artists with the with such a narrative that that I really just truly I'm amazed. And I'm also curious, what do you what are your experiences with the Houston art scene, and whether you felt that it kind of represents Asian American artists in like a in the way that I deserved.
Mm-hmm. Well, I put on a few shows, but I still think that my experience of the Houston art scene is very limited, partially because of pandemic, right? Everything was sort of shuttered down. And from what I could understand, there was a lot more activity happening in Houston prior to COVID. So my understanding is very limited. I only know it sort of through the people that I've worked closely with, you know, as well as people that I have been lucky enough to be in conversation with and to have studio visits with. And I think that there is an openness and a can-do attitude to the Houston art scene, but everyone's very open. Everyone's like, you want to do, yes, let's do a studio visit. You know, it's very quick and very easy and very flexible. And I love that, you know. And also I've only ever lived in sort of like smaller towns because papermaking takes up so much space. So I've never really been in a metropolitan area. And I'm like, oh my God, there's so many different institutions, there's so many different spaces and so many different kinds of people. And I was like kind of like a kid in the candy store a little bit. I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. So I love the Houston art scene. You know, I love that everyone is just so open. I think that's like the best quality about the Houston art community that I've experienced so far personally. And, you know, as far as representation goes, you know, I think that I think that's a complicated question. I mean, no, it's not a complicated question, it's a complicated answer. I think that there is still more work to be done, you know. But when I say work, I'm not just talking about galleries. You know, I'm talking about the different structures, political structures and social structures, you know, as well as like the immigration process. I think that part of what I felt as a young Chinese person in America is I've always felt very, very different from everybody else. But I didn't always know where I could go to, I didn't know where to look, you know. And so when you reached out to me about the Asian American Archive at Rice, I was like, this is amazing. And I said, I think I even said in the email, like, I wish I had something like this when I was younger, you know, because I don't know that for me, there were a lot of Asian voices, you know. And part of our culture has to do with like, I mean, part of my culture, I mean, at least Chinese culture as I understand, is that there's a part of it that is kind of like, you have to stay quiet somehow, you know, or you want to keep things to yourself, you want to always present a certain public face. And so there's kind of like I didn't know where I could go to have these more real or intimate conversations, or even more difficult conversations, you know, about what it means to be Asian American and what it means to be a Chinese American artist, you know. And now there's more resources and platforms where this is being addressed, you know. But it's still a lot of work. We still have a lot of work to do, and even saying that like makes me tired, but I think it's important, you know. And I think it's so special that this exists, you know, that this archive exists, that people can listen to it, you know. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and we also love it that you're contributing your stories for us, that many people will continue to be inspired by, I'm sure. And next, I guess we also want to kind of know more about you as a person. Do you mind sharing what you like to do outside of work, like in terms of art?
Yeah. Well, I really love making art, so I spend a lot of my time doing that. But when I'm not doing that, I love starting books, but not finishing them. I'm really bad at finishing books. I have like 10 books right now that I'm trying to finish. It's not good. I also love going on walks. It's my favorite thing. I am a creature of habit. I like to visit the same places every day. So I live pretty close to the Menil, and I walk to the field every day. And I sit at the field every day. That's something I like to do. I also love, there are a lot of kind of outdoor cats in Houston, and I love cats. I am a huge cat person. So when I go on these walks, I'm always saying hello to all the neighborhood cats. You know, I'm like, hey, Sam, or like, hey, Taco. And I sit down and I pet them for a little bit, and then I go on to the next cat, you know. Yeah, I'm like a really boring person. I like walking, I like making art, I like reading, and I like spending time with my family and with my partner, just really normal things, you know.
That's wonderful, and that cat story really just warms my heart.
I love cats.
Um, and next, I'm curious what you're working on next. For example, the next project, or would you see yourself doing in the next 5 or 10 years?
Um, well, I'm currently working on a new body of work where I'm engaging with the slower frequency of production. And I'm moving away from portals and pools, and I'm moving toward things that demand to come and that demand to be made. So I'm pulling from, my real life experiences, and I'm recreating these situations through memory. So yeah, so it's a little bit different. I mean, but not too different. I'm still working mostly with blues. And then in the next 5 or 10 years, gosh, I don't know. Well, I'm moving to Boston for a job where I will be a professor for the first time. So I hope that in 5 years, I'll be a good professor and a good colleague. And I'm working within sort of, a collaborative department of people who are interested in working together and being, you know, um, symbiotic with each other. And my practice is really, really important to me. So I hope that I can keep making work and I can keep being honest with myself about the work, and that the work makes continuous strides towards what it's supposed to be. I think I get a little bit closer every summer, but I don't think it's quite there yet. And once I get to where it's supposed to be, then I might stop making art, and I hope that I keep doing exhibitions. I hope I keep meeting artists and arts organizers that I can have meaningful conversations with. And I hope that I am, I guess, just okay, feeling okay, feeling good. Yeah.
Wow, that's great to hear, and congratulations on your new assignment.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. I guess as we are coming up to the 90-minute interview, and I will also love to invite you to leave a time capsule with us for the future. Would you like to do that?
What's in the time capsule?
So just anything that you would like, for example, think about a post-apocalyptic world that if like an alien discovers it, what would you like? Yeah.
Okay, so the time capsule is happening right now, like I'm making it right now.
Yes.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I don't have anything deep to say. I would just be like, hey, we were here once.
Wonderful. That also works.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And is there anything else that you would like to add that I haven't covered?
No, I think we had a really nice, long, meandering conversation. I think we covered a lot. And so thank you for, inviting me to be a part of this. I feel really honored and really privileged. I'm really excited. And it's been a pleasure, to do this, to be able to do this. I think it's really great.
Yeah, it's a pleasure and honor for us to be able to document your oral history. Thank you.
Thank you.